In January 2014, I spent 3 days and 2 nights in the Chernobyl exclusion zone, or the zone of alienation, in northern Ukraine, not far from the border of Belarus. I had a wonderful time, and I can say it's a very safe place to visit. You don't have to worry. I booked my tour through Chernobyl Welcome, and I specifically requested a private tour, but I didn't realize just how good of a decision it was to get a private tour until later. The bad part about getting a private tour is that, of course, the ticket is a lot more expensive. However, when you are going to a place that's notorious and is known because of its abandonment, its ghost towns, like Pripyat, it's, I think, better experience in small groups or by yourself, or just with a tour guide. And I didn't realize it, but my tour guide told me that recently, like 2013, 2014, they made it so group tours could no longer go inside any of the buildings because apparently one of the buildings had collapsed, and that was a safety hazard. So if you go on private tours with just you and your tour guide, maybe a small group, just a couple friends, you can get away with a lot more things, including going inside buildings, which I think is, for me, was one of the most moving parts, to walk inside an abandoned elementary school and see all of these gas masks everywhere, laying all over the ground, and seeing posters of instructions how to wear the gas mask. And of course they were scared of an attack from the United States, the Soviet Union's biggest rival at the time. But yeah, it was a pretty moving experience. When I first arrived there, I had done a lot of research, so I kind of knew a little bit what to expect, but there were definitely some things that were kind of unexpected. Number one, yes, you can actually spend the night in the Chernobyl exclusion zone. Around the Chernobyl nuclear power plant, there's a 30-kilometer zone that's strictly controlled by the Ukrainian government. And the only way in is if you get prior approval. You have to go through an official tour agency. You can't just walk up. Talk to a tour agency, give them your passport, and then they're able to work out the paperwork. So that way when you arrive there with your tour guide, they make sure everything matches up, and then they let you in. You're only authorized a certain amount of time, and all that, and everything's worked in advance. But luckily, if you go through a tour agency, which you have to do, they work out all those crazy details for you, so you really don't have much to worry about. And believe it or not, there's actually, I was told at the time in 2014, there were about 2,000 workers that still worked in Chernobyl. The nuclear power plant itself was still in operation for 14 years until the year 2000. That's when they shut down, I guess, the last radiator, or the last, whatever you want to call it, but that the facility itself was still in operation. And even though I didn't see very many people there, my tour guide told me that there were 2,000 people still working in the power plant itself, doing whatever, I don't know, also building the new safe confinement, this huge structure just to contain all the radioactive material, because on the power plant itself, in the immediate aftermath, they built a kind of a hasty cover that was supposed to last like 100 years. Well, of course, it's deteriorating, it's falling apart, and when there's rain and fires and all these things, there was recently a forest fire in Chernobyl, but if there's like another fire in the facility itself somehow, that could release all that contaminated material into the atmosphere again. And so yeah, for anyone that's looking to going to Chernobyl, I highly recommend going before they finish the new safe confinement, because then you won't be able to see the original facility itself anymore, which is a good thing, but it's bad for tourists. But when I spent the night there, I spent the night in Chernobyl City, which is just inside the exclusion zone, but still I'd say maybe 20 kilometers away from the site itself. Kind of confusing that they have a little city or a little town called Chernobyl City. But yes, that's what it's called, Chernobyl City. And in the small city, which most of it is abandoned. There's only a couple office buildings that are still in use. There's one little canteen or little cafe that serves food there, and one little hotel that's ran by a single Russian or Ukrainian woman. When I checked in there with my bags, I was the only tourist. I was literally their only customer, and it's very much a Soviet hotel. Everything that you would expect from a building that was built in the 1960s. Very, very thin walls. The beds were pretty short. Interesting decor. It's my first time ever going to a Soviet country, so it's a unique style. It made for an interesting experience. There was no toilet paper that first night, and when my tour guide left for the evening to go back home, I couldn't find the lady. I don't know where that Russian lady went, but there was no one I could talk to get more toilet paper. But luckily I was able to wait until the next day. But walking around that city, it's kind of a taste of things to come. There were a couple people working there during the day, but what really overwhelmed me was just how quiet it was, especially in Pripyat. You are miles and miles away from the nearest highway or road system. There's no cars going in and out. The population of Pripyat at any time is 2, and that's the 2 border security guards that are there 24 hours a day, just manning the gate. And every once in a while you might see a small patrolling unit of Ukrainian military making sure that the place doesn't get like tagged, graffiti, hooligans get in there and steal some property or whatever, because it is a living museum, and it's also dangerous to take some of those materials, take it out of that environment, take it to a city or whatever, because a lot of the materials that are in Pripyat are very, very dangerous. The most dangerous piece of equipment, I guess you could say, that I found was inside the hospital. In the Pripyat hospital, there's clothing there, and this clothing was worn by the first responders to the Chernobyl disaster in the early morning hours of April 26, 1986. These firefighters, they didn't know it. They didn't know how dangerous it was, but their mission was to stop the fire from spreading, to save the lives of the nearby town, the people from radiation poisoning, as well as lives throughout Ukraine and Belarus and the rest of Europe. And but these firefighters, I think there were about like 30 people that died in the first 2 weeks from radiation poisoning or radiation sickness. But these firefighters, after fighting the fire, they started to feel sick or ill or whatever, so they went to the nearby hospital, and they did ultimately die from their wounds, or from the wounds you can't see. But their clothes, their helmets, their boots, their jackets, their long pants are still in that hospital. The people that last wore those clothes died, and their clothes are still in the basement and on the ground floor of the hospital. And when I took my Geiger counter, put it close to the clothes, it started beeping right away. I can't remember the exact number what the reading was, but it was the highest reading that I'd gotten while I was there. And my tour guide told me that if you had that piece of clothing, that's like, I think it was a sock, he said if you put it in your pocket, I think he said after it would take like 2 weeks or 3 weeks or maybe as much as 6 weeks or so, but you would die from radiation sickness, which is crazy to think. After 3 decades, just a piece of clothing is still so dangerous that if you wore it or you touched it held on to it, kept it close to you uh, for relatively short amount of time, you could still die from that clothing. Um, so as far as my knowledge goes, that's probably the most dangerous clothing on earth, and I made a video on it. But walking around that city of Pripyat, it's really, really, as I said before, there's a quiet that I have never heard before. The place is surrounded by trees and moss and all these things that naturally absorb sound, but there's not much sound to begin with, at least human, man-made sounds. There's no cars driving around, there's no people talking. The only thing that you could hear is the wind going through the trees, and it had rained a little bit before I got there, and you could hear the echo of raindrops, or just puddles, just drops of water falling from cracks in the ceiling, from handrails, from rusty old handrails. And it was really, really quite eerie, and I recorded a video of me walking around the amusement park and just being in such awe. And I apologize because the audio on that isn't the best, because it was recorded from the microphone from my camera itself, so you could kind of hear the camera, the internal functions operating or whatever, so it doesn't capture the true quietness how it was, but it was a calm like I had never experienced before, and that quietness is made even more, I guess, impactful, or however you want to say it, because you're in a city that used to have 50,000 people. There's signs of life everywhere. You have tall apartment buildings, you have a hotel, you have a small amusement park, you have posters, Soviet propaganda, artwork, and all these things. There's a grocery store. You can see the hand baskets and the carts, and you can see chairs and all these things. You see all these signs of life. The city used to have 50,000 people. Now it's completely dead quiet, and that was most moving for me, is just being there and walking along decades worth of dead tree leaves, which I didn't realize it then, but apparently these leaves don't, a lot of the trees surrounding Chernobyl, they haven't died like any normal tree would. They just stay there, I guess, because of the radiation. So that makes it pretty interesting. And it's just absolutely crazy to think that just how busy the city must have been. I mean, it was a model town. The Soviet Union built this city. It was a closed city. It was only for the families and the workers and their families of the Chernobyl nuclear power plant. It was a model city, one of the most technologically advanced. The workers were relatively well paid and all these things, so people wanted to live there. People enjoyed themselves. They had access to food that a lot of the Soviet Union didn't have, and this incident caused that city to be abandoned within only a few hours. It took a few days before the Soviet officials said, okay, you have to leave now, but you'll be back soon. So only take your passport and a couple things with you, and you'll be fine. But they never came back. And you walk into some of these houses, and you literally feel like that's exactly what happened. You see newspapers, letters, books scattered all around. I remember walking in small school, as I said earlier. There's all these gas masks everywhere scattered around, but there's also like a little library. You can look through all of the books that the kids were reading. Some of them cartoons or comic books. A lot of there's still newspapers there, and unfortunately, some of it you can see there's signs of graffiti. You know, people that have gone there, maybe teenagers that have snuck in and they tag something, or they kind of mess the place up a little bit, throw some things around. But all in all, the place is just as it was 30 years ago when people left quick, fast, and in a hurry. But for anyone that's looking to go to Chernobyl, I highly recommend going and spending the night. There's a lot to see. The first day I was there was just kind of like a good introduction. You know, there's a number of small villages surrounding Chernobyl, and I visited some of those small villages. One village that we went by was actually bulldozed and buried underneath the ground, and there's signs, radiation warning signs telling you not to go on this flat patch of land. You're wondering why is this area, but that area used to be some buildings that were particularly radioactive, and now it's underground. And we also went to the nuclear power plant facility itself, just right outside the main gates. There's still people working there, a lot of construction workers working on the new safe confinement. And so, we got to stand right outside the front gates. Unfortunately, one of the guards came up to me, and I didn't speak Ukrainian, but my guy translated. I had to delete, I guess, some footage. They didn't want me recording the gates or whatever to Chernobyl. I guess that's understandable, but I was still able to get some good pictures. And went to Pripyat a little bit, and we also saw there's the Pripyat River is very interesting in and of itself, because the boats that were used to help evacuate some of the hazardous materials, and like a lot of the equipment is just sitting there. They just left it. Like there's the train. We didn't get to see it because I guess that's off limits now, as well as like a lot of cars. But when you go to the Pripyat River, there's a boat. I think there's a couple boats that are just completely rusted over. They're basically scuttled ships, just coming out of the water. They're all rusted, and they're very, very radioactive. It was too dangerous for them to move out of the city to go anywhere else, so they just left it there. The second day, we spent most of it in Pripyat, going in all the grocery store, some of the apartment buildings, and all these things. Third day, we went to the unfinished cooling tower reactor, which was actually pretty crazy, because on the top of this reactor or cooling tower, there's catwalks along the top, along the rim of the cooling tower. And my tour guide told me, and this cooling tower is so tall, 300 feet. I don't know how tall it was. Very, very tall. But my tour guide said when he was there the week prior, he did not see this large, huge piece of that catwalk on the ground, which was there when we went there. So things are still falling apart, and it can be dangerous. Luckily, no one was there at the time, but I can't imagine, how loud that must have been, just that huge chunk of that catwalk coming down and crashing on the ground. Luckily, nothing collapsed on our heads while we were there. But then we wrapped up the 3-day trip going on the highest view of the city. It's the top of an apartment building. And going in this apartment building was kind of crazy, because it's at least 10 stories high, 15 stories high. The elevator shafts are wide open. The elevator is, of course, collapsed, and you could peek into this empty, dark elevator shaft all the way down. You could easily, trip and fall down there. The building itself looks horrible too. It's in really bad shape, but there's broken furniture everywhere. The internal stairwell has no handrails, so you could easily trip and fall. But when you get up finally to the roof of this apartment complex, it is absolutely gorgeous. It's incredibly beautiful. It's a long way down, but the view is amazing. You can see the Chernobyl nuclear power plant off in the distance. Has a very unique silhouette. And most of the time when I was there, it was dark and gloomy, which was kind of fitting for the location. But even though it was completely overcast and a little bit rainy, the view from that top of the apartment complex was absolutely stunning. Seeing all the not the mountains, but all the buildings, the abandoned buildings, all the streets that just seem to stretch forever, the beautiful Ukrainian trees that haven't been tended in decades, so they're just growing, through the ground. You see all the moss and everything. But it's a truly incredible experience. For those of you that are having second thoughts on visiting, because it seems dangerous, it's not dangerous. Your tour guide will be with you at all times, so they'll kind of guide you. We can't stay in this place for too long. Some places are timed for how long you can visit there. My friend, the tour guide, said that you could get a maximum of 3 microsieverts per day. I guess that was the limit. That's how much every time you leave the exclusion zone or the little air, or Pripyat, or the most inner rim security. They have you go through a body scan. They scan your vehicle for radiation, of course. And the longer you stay in certain areas, of course, you'll collect more radiation. But most of the places are just fine. You get more radiation on airplanes. Airplanes are more dangerous than a lot of the areas around Chernobyl, but there are definitely a number, especially around the Red Forest, where my tour guide didn't want me getting out of the vehicle, and him saying, "Okay, this is it. You can see out the window. Okay, let's leave." But yeah, most of the areas are safe to go. You'll be fine. A lot of people have gone. If I die next year from radiation sickness, then I guess that means it wasn't dangerous, but feel fine, didn't get sick, and there's a lot of people that spend a lot more time there than I do, or than most people that work there full time, like the tour guides. And yeah, it was a great time. Very interesting experience seeing all the buildings and propaganda signs. Definitely a city stuck in time. It's very, very, very fascinating to go to. And if you do go, again, take a private tour or a very small group tour. It'll be worth it, even though it costs a little bit extra money. For those that like those kind of weird places, I guess, Chernobyl is definitely one of those places that captures the imagination. Yeah, if you have any specific questions, please ask, either in the comments or in a video message or whatever. I'll do my best to answer them. And to all my fellow travelers, good luck.